let's get down to today's business, and we are very, very happy and pleased to present to you Dale Perelman, who is an author, Newcastle area native, and former president of the King's Jewelry chain of stores, and he's here to talk about his most recent book, Road to Rust, the Disintegration of the Steel Industry in Western Pennsylvania and Eastern Ohio. And here it is. We have copies here today. There's copies in our gift store downstairs. But as I mentioned, Dale is past president of King's, which was headquartered in Newcastle. And you probably remember the stores at Eastwood Mall, Southern Park Mall, Borman Plaza, and also here in downtown Youngstown and Newcastle as well. Dale holds a bachelor's degree in English literature from Brown University and an MBA from the Wharton School in Industrial Relations, and he's a graduate gemologist from the Gemological Institute of America. He has served as the president of the Youngstown Credit Bureau, the Greater Newcastle Chamber of Commerce, the Pittsburgh chapter of the American Society of Appraisers, the Diamond Council of America, and Jewelers of America, in addition to being on the boards of various public, private, and charitable institutions. And so I give you Dale Perelman.
He's a little taller than I am. Well, it's great to be with you today. It's like old time week for me. I mean, I used to work when I was 16 years old in the King's Jewelry store downtown periodically, and Youngstown certainly has changed. But I'm not going to talk to you about jewelry today. I'm going to talk to you about the steel industry. And I'm going to talk to you about my newest book, Road to Rust. And if you'll notice on the cover of Road to Rust, two pictures that are in the Butler Museum. The bottom is William Gropper's strike of 1937, and the top is Joe Jones' We Demand. And Dr. Lou Zona, who's a friend, was kind enough to allow me to use these. But to talk to you about Road to Rust, I really have to go backward in time, and I'm going to take you to something called steel. And this is the first book I wrote on the subject. And steel began in around 1852 with, can everyone hear me? Good. With a man by the name of Ben Franklin Jones, who was raised in nearby New Brighton, Pennsylvania, and founded what later became Jones & Laughlin, or J&L Steel. And he was more in the iron business than the steel business. And the first real big name that we get in steel is this gentleman right here. He was a 5'3" dynamo, extremely intelligent. He left school at the age of 13. He worked his way up through the Pennsylvania Railroad to become the number 3 person. He was noted as a philanthropist. He was a man who was a good writer. He wrote several books, but he also was a man who could be quite deceptive and full of guile. And but what happened with this gentleman? In 1872, he went to England and he met a man named Henry Bessemer, who had the Bessemer steel process, which for years Youngstown used to produce their steel. And he signed a contract, and he decided to build the biggest plant in the country, and he called it J. Edgar Thompson. And he did that with good reason. First of all, J. Edgar Thompson was the president of Pennsylvania Railroad. And of course, he was going to be Andrew Carnegie's top customer for rails. So anyhow, right from the get-go, that plant was inordinately successful. And we come along with the story of Carnegie, and later on he hired this gentleman right here, Henry Clay Frick, who had H.C. Frick Coke and Coal as his president. And the book follows the disagreements that these two, they were like, I don't know, vinegar and oil. They didn't mix well, and they didn't get along. And eventually, Carnegie pushed Frick out, and Frick sued Carnegie to get fair value for his stock. So one of the interesting stories about these two is they never spoke to each other again after the settlement of a fair price. Frick got what he wanted. The two men never spoke again. The Duquesne Club took the pictures of Carnegie and Frick, put one on one wall, one on the other wall facing each other, and that was their idea of sarcasm. And even today, you can go in the Duquesne Club, you see these two guys facing each other. Well, Frick is really well known for the Homestead Strike, and I cover that in my first book. And I cover the Johnstown flood, I cover the railway strike of 1877, but pretty soon the year comes 1901. Andrew Carnegie is 65 years old. His new president of his company is a man named Charles Schwab. And I just took a picture of Charles Schwab's home in New York. It was 75 rooms. It covered an entire block. And my book is really a series of juxtapositions between the rich and the poor, and it just covers all kinds of juxtapositions. Anyhow, Carnegie decides he is going to buy land along Lake Erie near Sandusky, Ohio, and he's going to build one of the largest pipe plants in the world. And he's going to dominate not just steel, but finished goods. Well, the steel industry goes in turmoil. Several people run over to a man called J.P. Morgan, J. Pierpont Morgan, for whom Chase Morgan is named. And they say, you own Federal Steel, the number 2 steel maker in the company. What are you going to do about this? Well, he thinks, what's he going to do? He doesn't really like Andrew Carnegie. Andrew Carnegie likes him, but he thinks that Carnegie's arrogant. And he said, I'll tell you what, I'm going to go through Charles Schwab, who's the president, and find out if he's willing to sell. So Carnegie writes down on a piece of paper the price he wants, $480 million. Doesn't sound like a lot of money today. 1901, that was worth 25 times more. The dollar has depreciated 95% since 1900. That would have been something like $12 billion, of which Carnegie owned $6 billion. So the two men shook hands. A deal was made. They didn't shake hands. Let me change that story. They did not shake hands. It was made through intermediaries. Finally, Morgan called up and said to Andrew Carnegie, we should get together and shake hands on the deal. I'd like to have you come down to my office and we'll celebrate this merger. And Carnegie said, you know, it's just as far from my house to your office as it is from your office to my house. He said, you come up here. So Morgan did. And he came in the house and he said, Mr. Carnegie, I want to congratulate you. You're now the most wealthy man in the United States of America. Well, Carnegie looked at him and said, you know, maybe I should have asked for more money. And Morgan said, I would have given it to you if you had asked. Good day, Mr. Carnegie. Carnegie went off to Scotland. He was of Scottish descent. He was born in Scotland. And he went to a castle. And he disappeared from the steel industry, although his name didn't. There still were Carnegie steel plants, but he had no ownership in them. And he involved himself in things like Carnegie Hall, The Hague, the Justice Building at The Hague, the Carnegie Hero Awards, and he became probably the best known philanthropist until we get today to people like Bill Gates and Warren Buffett. So anyhow, that finishes steel. The merger ends that. But I pick up the story from a different angle. I tell the story of the merger now from J.P. Morgan's standpoint in Road to Rust and Judge Elbert Gary. Judge Elbert Gary graduated from what later became Northwestern Law School. He was a brilliant judge, and people said that Judge Gary wore silk gloves but had an iron fist. He was tough as nails in his own way. And he had a totally different philosophy than did most of the Carnegie men. Charlie Schwab and his crew were production-oriented. They believed that whatever they could do to reduce variable costs of manufacturing steel, they would more than make it up in years ahead, because they would undersell the market and demolish their competition. Judge Gary came from a financial background. He put together a financial board. His board had Marshall Fields, John D. Rockefeller Sr. and Jr., and yes, Henry Clay Frick, who was not a steel man, he was a finance man. And he and Schwab did not get along at all. So right from the get-go, you could see there was going to be problems between the two men. At the first meeting, Charlie Schwab decided that every time they had a board meeting at Carnegie, they would put a $20 gold piece in front of each board member. Well, usually somebody didn't show up. So they would draw lots, they'd draw cards to see who got the $20. They did that at the meeting. This man, Judge Gary, who was very strict, said, "We will have no gambling here." Well, later on, Charlie Schwab would go to Monte Carlo and he broke the bank. And even Carnegie wrote back, you've got to fire this man, he's a gambler. You know, it was a different time, different age. But anyhow, the year's 1901, U.S. Steel's just formed. Very first thing that faced them, they're totally unprepared. They're a loose confederation of 9 different businesses, hundreds of furnaces, dozens of plants, thousands of coke ovens, thousands of acres of ore lands along the Lake Superior, And they're totally ill-equipped for what came next. And that was the union, the amalgamated union of iron, steel, and tin workers struck when Gary refused them A, close contract, and B, total unionization of all plants. Gary did offer some compromises, and the union would have been smart to have taken them, but they thought this is the time to really attack U.S. Steel. The problem was the amalgamated was a part of the AFL, which was a craft union, and craft unions, other than for the highly skilled workers, did not fit in with the steel industry. And we'll get to that in a little bit. But anyhow, Judge Gary had money, unions didn't, they settled. 1901, they got over that strike. The next thing that happened, and by the way, this is the tin mill in Newcastle, which U.S. Steel purchased in around 1904 from the Greer family. Some of my pictures are in no particular order, so, but this was a typical steel plant in 1900. Next big strike came in 1909, and, well, let's go into this. The workers lived a very difficult existence. People called Pittsburgh hell with the steel, hell with the lid off. And I did one description of what it was like to be a steel worker, and I'll get back to these pictures. I'll just read a few paragraphs to you, if that's okay. Day after day, the roar of the furnace, the clang of chains, the pounding of the trip hammer slamming against an anvil, the thud of ore pouring into the hopper, and the hiss of steam buffeted the ears of the workers. Smoke, heat, and the acerbic stink of sulfur assaulted their noses. The glare of the blow during conversion and the haze that followed burned their eyes. Like the fiery conversion of pig iron into steel through beating and heating, the country bumpkins who entered the mill soon found themselves tempered into hard metal. Survival required quick reflexes. Sorry about that. I forgot to turn my phone off. I hope everyone turned their phone off. Survival required quick reflexes, strength, and thick skin. Those who entered as boys quickly hardened into men. Numbness, only numbness, made mill life tolerable. At workday's end, the married man might flee the clatter of the mill to seek solace in the quiet warmth of his house, a loving wife, and possibly the adulation of an adoring son or daughter. The laborer without family might seek escape by wasting his hard-earned dollars in the seedy bars or brothels surrounding the plant. The pressure from a real or imagined insult often exploded like a Bessemer heat into a fight. It mattered little who won or lost, because the next day the combatants would return to the hell of steel for another bout with the devil. So this is a picture of the smoke and fog that was Pittsburgh. One of the things that occurred was that most of the homes had no indoor plumbing, limited kitchens. They were crowded together. Some of these homes, duplex homes, might have 30 or 40 people in a single home. It was an awful existence. And they got water from the Monongahela River, the same river where steel dropped their slag, and this was true everywhere. It was true in Youngstown, it was true in Newcastle. The workers tended to live around the plant where it was smokiest, etc. So the workers had a lot of handicaps. Very awful environment. Poverty, as I mentioned, many lived in, and I point out specifics. In writing a book, I just got back from a Yale writer's course, and they said, always be as specific as possible. But without being too specific, this was housing in Pittsburgh. There was housing like this in Youngstown too. You'll see it at the Steel Museum here. And economic disadvantage. This is the Charlie Schwab house. This house had 75 rooms, was in New York because U.S. Steel moved their headquarters, part of it at least, to New York City. And unfortunately, this was torn down. There were, online yesterday, there were 10 major facilities, like the old Waldorf Astoria, the old Pennsylvania station, that were torn down. This was listed above them. And then, of course, the workers faced coal and iron police, which was a real problem. They had a difficult time competing. I'll get back to him later. Anyhow, in 1909, in McKees Rocks, there was a strike that I cover in great detail, and it was called the Press Steel Strike. And the owner of the plant was a man named Frank Hofstadt, and he was the nephew by marriage of Henry Phipps, who was a partner with Andrew Carnegie. And have any of you been to the Phipps Conservatory in Pittsburgh? Okay, that was named for Henry Phipps. He gave the money for it. All of these early robber barons, or whatever you want to call them, were great for mankind, horrible to man. By that I mean we have the Carnegie Library, Carnegie Libraries all throughout the country, organs to churches. All of them gave money, even the ones who did it quietly. I mean, you have the Frick Museum, and Henry Clay Frick usually gave his money quietly. There's a story that one of the banks in New York went broke during the Panic of 1907, and kids had $200,000 invested for their Christmas club. He gave the money back so that all the kids would have their Christmas club money. And, never said a word about it, but he did that. Anyhow, 1909, you have the Wobblies, the industrial workers of the world. They were socialist-oriented unionists. They appeared at McKees Rocks. They were badly trounced. The only thing that happened is in McKees Rocks, which Wall Street Journal called the last chance. It was just a terrible place to work. What happened was that they had a system whereby a foreman would get a sum of money, let's say $1,500, and the foreman had 15 workers, and the foreman divided up the money between him and the workers. And there were foremen who would keep $1,000 and give the workers $500 for the 15 or 20 people to split over 2 weeks. And it was grossly unfair. So at the end of the strike, the company did forego that system, and they built a park. So it wasn't all, that way. I come now to the strike in 1916, and that's an important strike to Youngstown, Ohio. It was a strike in East Youngstown. Many of you know the story. Some of you may not. What happened was there was a strike against, I talked to someone from Youngstown Sheet and Tube, and there was a strike against Republic. Things were going fairly well. Somehow shots were fired. That night there was a horrible riot. And I'll read you a little bit from the riot, partially my wording, partially Youngstown Vindicator. And we'll just see how this goes. Let's see. Where do I start? As darkness fell, frenzy overtook reason. The horde of protesters degenerated into a mob bent on destroying or stealing everything in its path. Anger and frustration justified mayhem. That is how most riots begin. First came liquor stores, which provided liquid courage. Broken windows and smashed doors at Barbas Liquor, McGrattan and Newman's, John McGarry's, Sagan's, Lombard's, Joe Kopp's, and Tom Goodware's saloons provided spirits, wine, and beer. Miscreants threw lighted torches haphazardly. As flames lapped at the closed stores, thieves poured through the building, snatching kegs, bottles, and barrels of alcohol and dragging them onto the streets. The police reported the theft of 700 cases, 23 pony kegs, and 15 barrels of beer, 512 quarts of whiskey, and 5 barrels of wine. Gluttons swigged whole bottles. Half-drunk felons hefted kegs and made for their homes. Arsonists leveled the post office and the Youngstown Sheet Employment Office. Next came the retail shops. Thieves sacked Ben Silver's Clothing, Abe Cohn Furniture, Christo's Meat Market, Schoenfield's Clothing, and dozens of tiny merchants, taking whatever suited their needs. Mr. Schoenfield lost $5,000 in inventory as thieves dragged piles of coats and handfuls of pocket watches through the shattered doorway of his emporium. A hooligan spit on the floor and set the store aflame. Mob members heaved rocks and bottles through windows of nearby shops to gain entry and claim their share of the booty. On the street, like a pack of snarling wolves, rioters battled for a larger share of the ill-gotten goods. 3 teenage boys up to no good and hungry for action snatched up a bottle of old overhaul rye whiskey the thieves had left on the street. The bottle, the oldest, perhaps 14 or 15, yanked the cap from the bottle and swigged heartily. The other 2 followed his lead until the bottle was emptied. Alcoholic rage pushed the leader to heft the empty bottle above his head and hurl it through a store window. Almost immediately, a handful of rioters broke into the building and seized whole armfuls of socks and shoes. "Let's get our share," the eldest roared. The boys raced through the window, heisting boots. They, too, had discovered the pleasure of looting. And it goes on and on and on. It was a terrible riot. 5 city blocks were destroyed. They called in the militia. Armed posse from the local DA came. The next day, I may have a picture here. I think I do, but it's out of order, so I'll come to it later. The next day, they arrested, and during the night, 200 people for taking part in the riot. The local authorities were embarrassed by what happened. They looked at all kinds of things to make sure it never happened again. So they decided one thing we could do is change the name of East Youngstown. And they did. They named it for James Campbell, who was the president of the steel mill, and that's how we have Campbell, Ohio. And when he died in 1932, they said that Campbell was the most wealthy man in all of Ohio. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. That's on the internet. Kind of a rest of the story. Campbell got his job. He worked for a man named George Wick. And George Wick had sickness. And around 1910, he decided to slow down. And he must have been very, very famous because we have Wick Avenue and Wick Park and all these things. But anyhow, he came back to work. And he decided he was going to go on a cruise. And he chose the Titanic, and he drowned. So we very well could have, if he had stuck around, very well could have had Wick, Ohio, instead of Campbell, Ohio. Now that's just my theory. Anyhow, that is where we were with the strike of 1960. The next thing we come to is the Depression. And, first we come to World War I, and the men come back from World War I, and they're looking for jobs. And the most famous strike in the steel industry, more famous than 1959, was the one in 1919 led by William Z. Foster. William Z. Foster was what's called a syndicalist, a socialist, and later a communist. He ran for president, didn't get many votes. I won't talk too much about that strike, but I will tell you that the violence in that strike was unbelievable. In Newcastle, we had a woman, her name was Sophie Johnson. She was Swedish. She was one of the strike leaders during the strike of 1919. She was unarmed. She was probably around 26, 27 years old. She was the mother of several little children. They shot and killed her. And Mother Jones came and spoke at the funeral. But there was so much anti-communist feeling. And this was, again, a strike where the Wobblies were involved. You really had a lot of people who came to the United States around 1895, sometimes around 1905, in that area. So you had a lot of foreigners who spoke very little English. And another juxtaposition you had was between the Eastern Europeans and the Western Europeans. Most of the good jobs originally were held by the Welsh. They were what were called puddlers. That's a job where it took a lot of skill. Later on, the Irish gained good jobs. Eventually, the Italians moved up and became officers and directors. It took the Serbians, the Hungarians, the Lebanese, it took them much longer. And they were, at this time, low man on the totem pole. And the union really did not support them. The union was working, as I said, it was an AFL union at that time. It was working for was working primarily for the skilled workers. So, and here's another picture of police in 1919. This is a book that's out about a woman called Fanny Sil, and it's kind of a gruesome picture. Maybe I shouldn't have shown it. She was unarmed. She was in Tarentum. She was shot twice in the head, and but badly beaten beforehand, and her body was disfigured. And the man who shot her took a hat. She was wearing a hat, put it on his head, danced around her body, and said, "I am Fanny Selling now." And by the way, he never was convicted of any wrongdoing. So it was a different time. That, by the way, is what East Youngstown looked like. It's out of order. But when I said the whole town was destroyed, That's a famous picture. Along came the Depression. And I just love this quote, so I'm going to read it to you. It's U.S. Steel was selling for $258 a share through what William Z. Ripley called prestidigitation, double shuffling, honey fueling, hornswoggling, and skullduggery. But by the time the Depression really came to fruition in around 1931, the economy was in shambles. People shared jobs. There were not enough jobs. Unemployment rate skyrocketed. Places like Youngstown suffered inordinately. Newcastle, Youngstown, Pittsburgh, more so than other places. The steel market just died. There were no dividends. There were no jobs. So what happened was the Republicans were thrown out of office. Who came in was Franklin D. Roosevelt. First thing that happened, it started to change the whole field. Aliquippa, Pennsylvania, which was known as Little Siberia, and it was the president there was a man named Tom Girdler, who will show in the strike. He led the strike of 1937 against unions. Anyhow, there was a woman, Celia Pinchot, who was the governor's wife, and she heard a rumor that a union organizer was locked up in a sanitarium for the criminally insane because they just wanted to get him off the streets. And the rumor was true, and that did happen. And she and the governor freed this man, and they had a huge parade in Aliquippa. And all of a sudden, union membership began to increase. But what really happened is this fellow here, Jarnell Louis. He was a steel man. He was loud. He was tough. He was mean. He could sprout Shakespeare, but he could shout profanities. He began to organize into what's called the CIO. He broke off from the old AFL. Things had happened. The Judge Gary had died. The old heads of the AFL, Samuel Gompers, had died. It was we had gone where most of the original board of U.S. Steel, including J.P. Morgan and Rockefeller Sr. So he came in, and by accident, he met with a man named Myron Taylor. This is Myron Taylor. He's a Cornell-educated chairman of the board of U.S. Steel. And Myron Taylor could see the handwriting on the wall. And after a lot of negotiation with Jarnell Louis, he signed a contract for $5 a day, just like Ford had, a $5 a day. It was a 6-page contract versus today's 200, 300-page contracts. J&L followed shortly thereafter, but Little Steel fought it out. Little Steel, and this is the famous steel strike picture from Chicago, where dozens of people were injured and several killed during a coal and iron police attack on potential strikers on a Sunday. And what happened was Little Steel defeated the union again, But along came World War II. And when World War II came along, the government had already sided with unionization, and this is the Youngstown Strike. That's another very famous picture of, and my book covers a lot of the Youngstown Strike, but if I tell you everything, no one will want the book. And here's another picture from 1937. But anyhow, what went on from there is that if you wanted contracts, they favored union plants, and basically the Steelworkers Union during World War II came in, and that essentially ended one part of my book. From there, I go into what I'd call the rest of the story, the rust. I skipped the strike of 1959. I was going to write a trilogy. Things in threes make good sense, but I had written so much on this stuff, I got tired of it. And I had other things I had to do. So I decided I'm just going to put the end here. I'm not going to talk about the strike of 1959. I'm not going to talk about any of that. I'm going right to the 70s. So I go to the 70s, and I give all the reasons. And have any of you heard of the book, And the Wolf Finally Came? There we go. It's a great book. I mean, there are other books available on that subject, but basically what I saw was three-edged sword, why steel rusted away. And my original name of my book was Steel to Rust. Steel doesn't rust, but that's all right. I like that better than Road to Rust. My publisher said it's Road to Rust. I'm not arguing with them. So anyhow, we have the government. World War II ends. What do? We have the Marshall Plan. We encourage Germany and we encourage Japan to build steel mills, and not just steel mills, but the latest electric arc steel mills and whatever they had back then. That might have been right before electric arc mills, but anyhow, they built much finer facilities than we did. And then the government gave them certain tariffs, advantages, and things like that. And like today, there's no doubt that China gives support to their steel industry indirectly. So that was one part of the blame. The steel companies, another part of the blame. Steel companies did not put in electric arc furnaces. There were a few Bessemers still running. There was, we were back in the 50s when they were in the 90s, and that's in like 1950. We didn't know how bad things were because the market was growing, buildings were being built, steel had new uses, car industry was good, and we didn't realize that specialty steel was an important feature. One story I do tell, and it came from somebody from Jones and Laughlin. J&L used to be the largest hanger producer in the country. And eventually it was taken over by a group of accountants, and the accountants said, you know, we're only making X amount per hanger. If we make pipe, we can make 5 times that amount on each ton. Well, what they didn't realize that hangers were somewhat inelastic in terms of demand. Piping goes up and down like a yo-yo. You know, when Marcellus Shale was hot, everyone wanted pipes. And what happened was they got rid of the stability of their company. And so that was one case of an error in judgment. People would want specific smaller quantities. They didn't want the smaller quantities. They allowed those to go to Nucor and some of the new types of mills that are out there. And thirdly, you have to blame both management and labor for 13-week vacations, high wages, crazy work rules, and on down the line. So that points out to what I call, whoops, I think I turned it out. Let's try that again. That led to something that looked like that. So basically, at this point in time, I thought about ending my book with a little poem, and it's called Ozymandias, and it's by Keats, and it's Shelley, excuse me. My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty in despair. Nothing beside remains. Around the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away. In other words, gone. Steel industry as we once knew it had rusted away. However, I decided I was going to tour some modern steel companies. And I did. And this is from Elwood Quality Steel. And I'll read you one last paragraph. Today's steel making involves increased productivity from a smaller workforce. At one time, it took 10 man-hours to produce 1 ton of steel. Now, a ton can be produced in as little as 15 minutes in some plants as a result of technological advancements. When I recently toured the Elwood Group facilities, I viewed electric arc furnaces pouring boiling steel into massive ladles and giant presses pounding out multi-ton beams. A handful of highly skilled workers manning sophisticated computer stations controlled the processes. And basically, that's what steelmaking is today. You'll never again see the massive numbers of people in the steel industry. So that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. Do I have time for a question or two? I have time for a question or two. I may not be able to answer it, but maybe we'll get some questions. No questions. Yeah, one question. Yes, that's exactly what I'm talking about. Today, Elwood Quality Steel, for example, they're a $1 billion company. Our biggest company in steel today is Nucor. U.S. Steel, which was number 1, is number 16. And we're really number 5 if you count India and China, Japan, and the Commonwealth. And, then we come next. And we're barely ahead of Brazil and Russia in terms of steel production. So, yes, in the back.
Do you know anything about the turnaround of the U.S. steel plant in Slovakia?
I don't.
They were trying to sell it, and now I think they're going to keep it.
Oh, good. You know, of course, U.S. Steel, when things got real bad, that's when they bought an oil company instead of investing in steel. So that tells you something. But that's good news. Yes, sir.
Do you know if this is true? The Copperweld Steel was bought by a financial conglomerate, and the reason they bought it was for the scrap that was sitting behind the mill, and then when the scrap was gone, they closed the mill.
It's possibly true. Financial concerns have They don't confide in me, unfortunately. But they think differently about things. First of all, when you look at the stock market today, the stock market is based on what's happening today. Today, the stock market's dropping because they're worried about what China's going to do regarding the tariff. The financial concerns, that's how they think. What happens is the better way to think is honestly like Charlie Schwab thought. You know, think about what will make tomorrow much better. And unfortunately, the financial concerns don't always look at that. They're looking for quick rewards. So, hey, it was nice talking to all of you. I have books available if any of you are interested. I'll sign them. They're $16 each. I have Steel, I have Road to Rust, and I have some older ones I did that are bargain basement books for $5 each. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dale, for coming here and making that presentation on your book and looking back at our steel industry here in western Pennsylvania and eastern Ohio, and we greatly appreciate it. Thank you all for coming again, and hope you can be with us next month, Thursday, July 19th, when we'll have Craig Snyder here talking about the boxing capital of the world. See you then.